No, thank you so much, Dr. Thema, for joining us.
Absolutely.
You are so accomplished. My
Oh,
goodness.
thank you.
I mean, everything from your industry to magazines to Twitter. You're like a Twitter superstar. Like, oh my gosh, 15,000 people just retweeted your wisdom. Like, you're amazing. And I
Oh,
can attest from our
thank
own
you.
relationship, yeah, that you
I'm grateful. I'm grateful. And it's wonderful to see all the doors opening for you.
are.
And I'm just excited that you're using the platform to raise awareness for people and to bring the healing. So that's so necessary, that it gives people permission.
Mm.
Yeah.
Amen. Well, thank you. I mean, and you're so unique too, because not only are you a licensed psychiatrist,
Mhm.
you're a
Psychologist.
psychologist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Always get the two mixed up. You're
Right.
a licensed psychologist, but
Yes.
also you're a woman of faith.
Yes.
Right? And you're very
Yeah.
active in ministry as
Mhm.
well. And I know that that's something that a lot of people have wondered about just with regards to mental health, right? Because
Mhm.
we're talking about mental health right now, which is so important. And
Yeah.
some people wonder, well, is mental health spiritual? Is
Mhm.
mental health emotional? Is it genetic? And so
Mhm.
I wondered if you could speak to that. Like when we talk about
Sure.
mental health, what are we really talking about?
Yeah. So the mental health component is the psychological and the emotional. And when we think about holistic care or holistic wellness, it really is mind, body, spirit. And so sometimes people want to substitute a treatment for one for the treatment for the other, right? So, for example, if someone has schizophrenia and they say, well, I'm going to take vitamins. So, vitamins are going to help your body to be healthy, but they're not going to address the mental health issue, right? Or so we put ourselves sometimes in the position of thinking it's a false choice. So some people will say, I don't need therapy, I pray, as if you have to choose. But the reality is you can pray on your way to therapy. You can pray after therapy.
During therapy?
Yeah, you don't have to choose. And the stress that we feel, it affects us holistically. So there is a spiritual component, there's a psychological component, and it also shows up in our bodies. So some people have started talking about what we call embodied healing, because we hold stress in our back, and especially in minority communities, oftentimes the way we label our distress is with physical symptoms. So we have migraines. We'll say, I'm not depressed, I have migraines. Or I'm not anxious, I'm nauseous, right? So it's in the body. So there are things that we can do to take care of releasing the stress from our physical bodies. And I know, like, for some people, going to the gym is therapeutic. And there is a release that comes from working out, but it's not going to address all of the psychological or all of the spiritual.
Wow, let's see. Do you feel like, now mental health is a huge topic. Do you feel like it's something new that all of a sudden a lot of people are experiencing mental health issues, or do you feel like, well, it just hasn't been talked about like it's being talked about now?
Right. So before the pandemic, I would have just said it hasn't been talked about. But I will say, in the midst of the pandemic, that people are experiencing more distress. So even those who weren't experiencing it before are experiencing it now, or those who already were experiencing it, it's heightened. But the reality is, many of our parents and grandparents had emotional or psychological challenges, and there was not either the language for it or the permission to name it in that way. So a great example I think about from within the African American community is we often use this term nervous breakdown. In psychology, there's no such term. So
Wow.
right, if you talk to Black people, they all have a relative who had a nervous breakdown. But like, we don't have a diagnosis called nervous breakdown. So we have to ask people to describe, like, what did that look like? Because people, it's almost like when people use the term hooking up as the cover, but it means a whole lot of different things. So you have to ask specifically what happened.
Yeah.
So with a nervous breakdown, some people will say, like, oh, my mother started crying and shaking, or my mother couldn't get out of bed, or it could be father as well. And so sometimes we have coded language. Another one is like zapping out, right? So we'll say, is zapping out new? New, no, right? Someone losing it, like, what does that mean? So we have heard about these instances historically, but we often didn't have the language for it. And we also have had a lot of pressure to cover it up. And one of the things I'm mindful of is as children growing up, we often hear the term fix your face, right? Like that's a real like thing. And we don't say heal your heart, because it's not really that we need you to feel better. We just don't want to see it, right? So then we grow up learning to mask. And there are various reasons for that, family-wise, religion, culturally, that we feel the need to pretend. But pretending and masking are not the same thing as being healed. And I think all of us can think of times when we faked it, like when you felt horrible, but we know how to just like put it on. Or sometimes if you're tuned in, you can pick up on that in other people. Like they're saying everything is fine, but you just feel something is not right, And so now there is less stigma. There is still some, but less stigma in people acknowledging that they've had depression or a panic attack or PTSD, or that they're in therapy or on medication, that there is more of an acceptance of people talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's so cool. I mean, I just wonder, like in this whole pandemic time, there's so much talk about pre-existing conditions, right? And normally we're talking about respiratory conditions and asthma as it relates to COVID. But I really started thinking about that when it comes to mental health, plus this pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
What are those pre-existing conditions emotionally, psychologically, that can really trigger us to switch over into an unhealthy place emotionally?
Absolutely. Great question. The reality is some people were already struggling with depression, already struggling with thoughts of suicide. And so then if you turn on the 24-hour news cycle, and every day literally it's a death count, you're just watching those numbers. So it can really heighten people's sense of like hopelessness and despair. Another one is anxiety, right? If I was already an anxious person and now everyone is saying like, be careful, right? Like there is danger. So before it was like this free floating anxiety of I'm just looking out for danger, but I don't know where it's coming from. But now people are telling me like it's coming, right? So some people have talked about if they already live with obsessive compulsive disorder, so people who have to wipe things a certain number of times or turn things off and on. So they talk about how we call it triggering, how triggering it is for them to see everybody doing it, right? Because it's one thing if you're wiping things a million times and a part of you knows like, I can stop, it's okay, let me put it down. But now everyone is saying like, wash off your groceries, like wipe the counters, wipe the doorknobs. So then it can be difficult to figure out like what's enough, like how many wipes is enough, right? Another one that comes up is around eating disorders. And we usually think about anorexia, but the other piece is with emotional eating. And everybody has kind of confessed to this in social media. And, we'll jokingly say, right, I'm eating all
I need some comfort right now. Comfort me.
Yes, yes. So, we need all of this to soothe us. And, what I say in the podcast about emotional eating is often we're hungry. It's just we're not actually hungry for food. So it's for me to get in touch with like, what is it I'm really hungry for? Like comfort, safety, security, companionship for those who are quarantined by themselves, right? So all of those things can show up. And when people were already struggling with addiction, right? And so now you don't have the in-person like AA groups meeting, although they're meeting online or by phone. And of course, they determined that liquor stores were essential businesses, right? So if you're already stressed and, people are like, I need something to take the edge off. I need something to calm, my nerves. So addictions are big. And then one last one I'll mention is domestic violence. Unfortunately, it's really on the rise because there's not a break, right? So you imagine being quarantined with someone and it's not safe. And like, where do you go? not only how do I get there, but also where do I go? So it's challenging.
That's why, I mean, there's so many challenges, and I guess I wonder how, first of all, because there's so much to unpack, but first of all, how do I know, how do we know if we fit into one of those categories? How do we know, maybe you can talk about what actually defines depression or defines anxiety or even defines abuse. And how do we know if we're experiencing that or just having a bad day?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And one of the distinguishing parts of depression, major depression, is it has to last for at least 2 weeks. So if I had a bad day, but tomorrow I woke up and I felt better, well, then you weren't depressed, you were sad, right? And so we want to be careful about self-diagnosing or throwing the term around, because what happens is people who have only been sad a day or two will try to give advice to people who have major depression, and it's not helpful. It's very judgy, right? So we'll say things like, well, when I feel sad, I go for a hike and then I feel better. So like, you should just hike, right? Well, that helped you because it was just like a day of sadness. But when we're talking about like severe depression, some of the symptoms are decreased energy. So for people where it's even a struggle to get out of bed, like when people show up for work or to church or wherever they're going, we don't realize some of the people sitting there had to fight to show up. Like for some of us, we just jumped up, took a, you had to deal with traffic, but it was
right.
not.
And mad about the traffic.
Right.
Mad,
Right.
angry about that traffic.
Yes. But like, that's the biggest hurdle. It's like all these other people trying to get somewhere before the pandemic.
Right.
But for people who, like, your body will not cooperate with you, that you physically have to fight to get up. Difficulty sleeping is another one, and that can go either way, either not being able to get up or not being able to sleep. So sometimes the insomnia. It affects your appetite, so either loss of appetite or cannot stop eating. Depressed mood, as I said, that would last at least for 2 weeks, where that's every day you're feeling that. You can have thoughts of self-harm and thoughts of suicide and feeling hopeless, helpless, power. Because here's the thing, it's like when I can no longer believe or see that things can get better than this, right? That's when I get to that suicidal part where like, I just can't see this changing and I cannot bear it, right? And then one more I'll just mention is loss of pleasure in the things you used to enjoy. So that's really challenging where, before when I'm sad, if I go, like I love dancing. I'll say like, oh, if I should take a dance class, I'll feel better, right? If I'm feeling sad, and that will work for me. Or for people of faith, like I just need to pray about it. And okay, I prayed and like, all right, I feel all right. But when you're depressed, the things you used to turn to are not effective. Like it's not breaking, So that's what you want to tune into for the depression. For the anxiety, it's like excessive worry about multiple things. And it's to the point where it's affecting my ability to function, right? So I'm stuck in some ways. I can't make a decision because I'm so worried about making the wrong decision. Or, I can't trust anybody because I'm afraid like everyone's going to betray me. So I'm very vigilant, very worried, anxious, and it's overwhelming, as opposed to, like everyday worry is like, okay, I got laid off. I don't know when I'm going to get a position, but hopefully like one is going to come, but I don't feel like consumed or overwhelmed by it. And it's not so overwhelming that I can't look. I can go online and look for, and where some people, it's so overwhelming, it's hard for them to even engage in the job search, right? So those are ones to be aware of.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then I guess the question is, if I already have a pre-existing condition, right? Whether it's I tend to have sad days or I'm actually dealing with depression,
yeah,
or anxiety, right? If a person is feeling anxious, or feeling elements of anxiety, I guess the question is, how do you go from these places into a place of joy or into a place of happiness or into a place of peace? Because like you said, it's not always as simple as, oh, I took a hike, I feel better now, the end, right? Like for some people, it's really an obstacle and it's really a fight.
Yeah.
So what can people do?
Yeah. So, and I will tailor these specifically related to the pandemic of us, if you're dealing with mental health issues and it's like during this time, the first thing I would say is limiting our exposure to the news.
Yes.
We want to
I
be
did it and it has delivered me.
it's like be informed, but you can't drown in it,
No.
So, and because there's a point where there's a certain point where they're no longer reporting real things, they're just commentary, like it's all day long, like what do you think, what do you think,
What do you
but
think
it's
of the
no
same
new,
thing?
yeah, it's no information. So pick whatever you consider a trusted news source, get like the information of the day, whatever that might be, and then like to turn it off. Because when that is your background, and I've had clients with that where, because right now we're seeing everyone online, and like they literally have the news on all day long in the background, and you're already depressed and anxious. That is intensifying it, right? The next one is around social support, social connections, because one, either people are quarantined alone, or they may be quarantined with people that are a source of stress for them. So then making contact, using like these platforms or using your phone to reach out and not to wait for people to call you. Because sometimes there was an interesting back and forth on Twitter where someone was saying, if you haven't heard from anybody in this pandemic, they're not your real friend. And then someone else replied, if my real friends haven't called me, it's okay. They might be going through, right? Everybody handles this differently. So it's that piece of like trying to show grace and compassion, because literally you don't know. I mean, I've entered into conversations with people and then they say, well, my aunt passed away from, you don't know, or their wedding was canceled, or graduation was canceled, or they're laid off. And so taking the initiative to reach out, but I will say to make sure we, along with caring for people who might face challenges, to reach out for people where it's actually replenishing, right? Like where it's mutual, where it's reciprocal, not just you're the caretaker of everyone. So that's especially true for people who are usually the strong one in their circle. Is like, if you are the quote unquote strong one, there is a role that we play in creating that by never letting people in, by never talking about how we're being affected or what we're feeling. And so to have some social connections where you can be honest, transparent, where you don't have to mask it, where you can be open. So having those social connections are important. Therapy is important, because the reality is, especially if we're talking about like obsessive compulsive disorder, addiction, depression, our friends can support us as a friend, but friendship or marriage or being a good sister or brother to someone or a good parent is not the same thing as doing therapy. So along with your social supports, getting the mental health support with someone who is informed about what it is you're facing can be very helpful. And then I would say watching the unhealthy coping strategies. Because if I turn to like only the food and the drinking or the smoking, then what happens, like alcohol is a depressant. So you'll feel better in the moment, ha ha ha, like while I'm tipsy, and then it's a crash. So you want to be really careful about the things I'm turning to with grace, right? No judgment about it, but like, is it really helping me, or is it actually making me feel guilty or feel worse, right? But like trying to do exercise and get moving, trying to eat some fruits and vegetables, drinking water. And then there's an aspect of this that is out of our control, but then doing the things we can do. So like the hand washing and the mask and the gloves, and those kinds of things, being of service to others. People have talked about dropping off groceries for elders or for neighbors. And then for those who are people of faith, I would say definitely using our spiritual practices, and to know, I'll say from a Christian perspective, that it is absolutely understandable to have faith and worry, right? We have these slogans like, if you have faith, you'll never worry. Like we're in a pandemic, and that's
Sure.
also right. Yeah, well, you should be able.
But I will say, once I confronted, because a lot of the things that you're talking about are things that I experienced, right? Like that first week, I was so done. I mean, there was it was so much bad news back to back, not only on the news, television, but also in my own life, right? Like I got this, and then that, then my show, and then all these things, the job shut down, and the tenants, and all these different things of finding out. And by the end of that week, I was crying. I was a mess.
Sure. Yes.
And then but I was grateful though, because the next day, after a whole prayer call and everything, I was reminded that God is God even now, that this did not come as a surprise, that my job or my show or the tenants or whatever, that none of this is outside of God's control. And so for me, it was a thing of either I'm going to pray and then have faith, or I'm going to worry and spiral into this whole other place. And once I anchored myself and said, I'm going to choose to exercise faith like never before. That for me made me feel so much better, because I felt like I could lean on God and relax into God, versus, every day being the same level of anxiety and stress.
Yeah. So I think it's important that both seasons happened, right? In terms of like even your grieving season, because those were a lot of losses, right? So like if you lose your job and the tenants aren't doing this and they aren't doing this, and we're just like, I don't care, right? Then like something is wrong. Something is wrong, right? So the fact that you grieved it, those were losses. But then after, I grieved the losses, then like you had community, you used your spiritual practices, and we would call it like a cognitive reframe of like, this is a surprise to me, but like God is not surprised. Okay, right? So it is, but so I say that to say, if you were to encounter someone who is in a place of like grieving their losses, that like there's no shame in that. If someone says like, I was laid off and like, this is tough. It's like, oh, yes, definitely. So us also having grace and compassion for each other while we figure out and all of us, one of the things I've discovered is we all kind of cope differently and need different things. So for example, some people, like the way they cope is with busyness, right? So they're coming up with projects around the house or even projects out of the house or Zoom projects like that. That is what helps some people. And then for some people, it's like, to get through this day, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to look out the window, I might watch some Netflix, and like success, like got through the day, right? I did it. I did it.
I binge watched that whole show.
Yes. So, and because what we do, one of the key things in terms of the joy is to come out of comparison. Because I say this especially for parents, online, you'll see some people who are like cooking all of these fabulous meals every day, sewing with their children, doing all these like home economics activities, right? If that's not your thing, to not feel like, oh, I'm doing something bad because other moms in the pandemic are like baking cakes every day. So like, that's what works for them, right? That's what fuels them. They're enjoying themselves. So it's figuring out, like you did with the prayer call, what speaks to you, what nourishes you. And then I don't have to make it a prescription that's one size fit all for everyone, right? For some people, the arts, music can be healing. And some people want silence. So you got to like experiment with it, especially if your former things aren't working for you. So if the things that used to bring you joy aren't, to being open to the new, right? What is it that's going to feed me during this time? So whether that's the arts, community, spirituality, online therapy. So discovering your joy, and it's like an experiment, right? Of seeing what that is without, so in mindfulness, we would say without judgment, right? Because if I feel bad and now I'm judging myself for feeling bad, I've multiplied my problems. Right.
Kind of digging a deeper hole for yourself.
Yes.
So I wonder if you are really being intentional about maintaining joy, about choosing to come out of a dark place, right? And you've committed yourself to embracing a lot of these things on a regular basis in order to create a life and atmosphere of happiness and joy. And let's say you are either quarantined with or in in close contact with people who whether it's by choice or whether it's by chemistry, are simply not experiencing the happiness that you feel and the joy that you feel. How do you maintain that for yourself without mirroring, if a person's angry or upset or mean or judgmental or whatever, and this is COVID-19 and beyond, right? Because these are circumstances that are in marriage, that are between parents and children, that are between fathers and children and mothers and children, just so many, and friends, like we don't all have the same temperament. So I wonder, how can you maintain your sense of joy where it's infectious toward others versus being overcome by the energy of others?
Yeah. So a couple things. One is to allow for, and I know it's hard and depending on people's how much space is in their living space, but to allow for some together time. And some people also need that individual time. And for us not to take that personally or as a slight, that there is a need for our internal process. So for some people that may be, I'm going to stay in the bed longer because I want some time to be by myself. Some people take a long shower, a long bath, or, if people feel comfortable going for a walk, right? And that's also the thing with the social connections, because if the only person I'm speaking to is the person who is really in a storm, that's going to be very challenging, right? So I recognize they're in the storm, so I'm not going to look for them to be sunshine. That's not where they are right now. But, if that's calling a cousin or calling a girlfriend where, we can laugh it up and that's okay. And in my interactions with the person, we have something called holding space. So when I hold space for someone, I give them the emotional space and permission to be where they are. And I don't run in trying to fix it. I think that's one of the big ones, is when we try to kind of be like the mini messiah, because what that ends up doing is making people feel like they have to pretend for us, right? So then they don't actually feel better, but they feel like, you're like, I'm not going to leave till you smile. So then they're like, okay, I'm smiling, I'm good. So to be able, and this takes the willingness on both parts for neither to have a judgment against the other one. Meaning, for the person who is sad to not be irritated with the one who is joyful, and the one who is joyful to not be angry with someone for being depressed. And, I'll give this example personally because, my parents have talked about mental health. My mom has struggled with depression. She's a woman of faith, preacher, prayer warrior, all these things. And my dad is like the happiest person you ever want to meet. And they, and so they know each other, they appreciate each other. And as she's seeing, and she's also an intercessor, for those who don't know, prays for people.
And it seems like a lot of intercessors really
feel it deeply.
Oh, yeah, so empathetic and really take on those emotions.
Yeah. So, as she's seeing, what is happening around the world, and people who are not being treated well, it's grievous, right? And my dad, if you talk to him, he's like, I'm just grateful, right? And so but they are comfortable with telling their truth and honoring where the other one is, because he gets she goes in and prays for people, and, but that's her temperament and kind of her rhythm, right? Now, of course, if it's in a really difficult place, then, she'll work to not stay in that place. But it's not that he just says, you just need to be grateful, right? Because that just would fall flat. And, and then for him, he goes on walks. He's like Mr. Walker, right? He's walking around town with his mask on. And, but they also then spend time together. right? So it's like, I want to be, I would say also for the joyful person, having to be careful that we don't take on um, this idea of being unaffected, right? That, it does have an impact. So to be able to name that, not necessarily to say to them, like, you need to be joyful because you're a downer, but like, if I recognize that within myself, if I feel that that's starting to take me somewhere, then I'll have to do the things I can do to nourish me. And then I will also say, for the partner who, who either has depression or anxiety, to be intentional about, and even though it is more of a fight, to be intentional about, there's sometimes where I have to like tuck, and it's a fight, but tuck that away to see like, what does my partner need, so that it's not one-sided, right? Because yeah, you want to be able to show up in the relationship knowing it's not the same as if you just have a selfish partner or an uncaring partner. The person is struggling, but in the ways that they are able to figure out, like, how can I show up for this person?
That's
Yeah.
good. That's really good. And I know earlier you mentioned abuse, right? You mentioned how, and that's been, honestly, that's been a reality that has pained me so deeply that I've really tried to shut it out, because the idea that people are being abused right now, whether it's children or spouses or what have you, because
Mm-hmm.
of, or exacerbated by
Yeah.
this container,
Yes.
is absolutely heartbreaking. And I just wonder, first of all, what a person can do. You know what I mean? Like, whether it's a child that's experiencing it or whether it's another adult, what can they do if they feel like, this is my house, I'm not supposed to leave, but I'm with an abusive person?
Mm-hmm.
How do I get out? How do I break free? And again, whether it's this COVID era or beyond this time.
Yeah. So one of the challenges that, for the person to first figure out is, are they, do they feel safe to try to escape right now? Because one of the things, unfortunately, we found with domestic violence, that the threat increases once the person knows you're trying to leave. So like, that's very real. And so only the person who is living in there has a sense of like, is that is that going to work for me? So for example, some people, some abusers, if you get a restraining order, like, they don't want any trouble with the law. So then like, they see that and they're done. Whereas some abusers, it makes them more angry, right? So it's trying to determine not only your situation as it relates to that person, but also where are you emotionally? Because often, for various reasons, people are trying to make it work, right? And one of the things we do know is that usually abuse escalates, right? We often will say like, oh, it was just once, or, the hope that, well, it's just the stress of the pandemic or the stress of the layoff, or it's only because they were drinking. So if there are any times in the house, when the person, let's say, goes to the store, or when you're the person who goes to the store, if you're able to, make a call. So whether that is calling a friend, calling a hotline, calling the one of the good things in most major cities is they have police that are now trained specifically to address domestic violence. And for those who have issues with the police, there are also domestic violence advocates that work with the police in most major cities, so that those can be safe people for you to talk to and to plan to figure out, creating a safety plan. So it's so important to know that there are people who care, who do want to help you. And I would say this is really important. If you're the family member or friend, don't get impatient with them. Sometimes we get mad at people for going back or for being with the person. And when we do that, we make what the abuser said true. The abuser wants to isolate them and tell them nobody cares.
Yeah.
And so when we're like, well, you went back or you're not leaving, so I'm done with you.
Yeah.
I know it's hard, but just to be patient and say like, you know, if you're not ready, I'm still your friend, right? So what if you tell me how I can be helpful? If it's just to, because some people I think they get tired of hearing it. So it does take a certain ear to be able to know, like people are working through, they're trying, this wasn't the picture, you know, it wasn't the picture of how they thought life was going to be or marriage was going to be. And, you know, the challenge for children as well is trying to figure out a safe adult to tell, because often the other parent is not able to protect them, which is, you know, an issue. But if there's before, of course, when they were going to school, we would have said guidance counselor or a teacher, but a friend of the family, somebody at the church you feel is trustworthy, to reach out so that you're not struggling with it by yourself.
This is so good, Dr. Thema. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I guess just in conclusion, as far as us really doing our best to live a happy or joy-filled life, while also, it sounds like what you're saying is acknowledging, allowing yourself to acknowledge when you feel pain, or when you feel stress, when you feel anxiety, not feeling like you have to skip over that, not feeling like you have to deny it, but also finding healthy ways of balancing it so that it doesn't overwhelm and overcome you.
Right. Yeah, so important. So cultivating your joy. So in therapy, I work a lot with trauma survivors, and one of these terms is post-traumatic growth. So it's like this pandemic is difficult, but out of this, are there ways that I can grow in terms of my sense of myself, in terms of my relationships going deeper, in terms of me opening myself to new opportunities? Like you said, a lot of doors have closed. So people are becoming creative or thinking like, well, when it reopens, is this really the career I want? So it's a lot of reevaluating. You can grow in your spirituality, and at the same time, giving yourself and others grace and compassion for the fact that this is a global pandemic, right? So if you are depressed or anxious, yes, we're in a global pandemic. So then doing the things though that nourish us, and as you hinted at earlier, daily practices, right? Because if I just call one friend like 3 weeks ago, that's not gonna keep it going, right? So if you say, what's my daily routine? Meditation or prayer, or every day I'm gonna have a social contact, or once a week I'm gonna have therapy, every day or every other day I might try to exercise. So mind, body, spirit, and addressing each aspect of yourself. So yes, you prayed, and yes, you exercised. Now, what are you doing for your mental or emotional health?
So good. Thank you so much. And how can people stay in touch with you? Where can they find you?
Absolutely. So my website is Dr. Thema, and that's DRTHEMA.com. I'm Dr. Thema on Twitter and Instagram. And last year I started a podcast called the Homecoming Podcast. And yay, it's on YouTube, iTunes, SoundCloud, and Spotify. So check it out for more mental health tips.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I love you. We're so happy to have you.
Oh, thank you. This was wonderful. I appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.